Hi, this is Nellie Mackay, and you're listening to Everything Fab Four on Salon.com.
Welcome to Everything Fab Four, a podcast focused on fun and intelligent stories about the Beatles. I'm your host, Ken Womack, music culture columnist for Salon.com and a Beatles scholar and historian. No other band, or popular phenomenon for that matter, has enjoyed the global impact the Beatles have and continue to have more than 50 years later. They are part of our human fabric. They created music that continues to bring people together, and just about everyone has their own Beatles story to tell, some that are surprisingly deep and unexpected. This show seeks to draw those stories out in interesting and insightful ways. Remember, it's a Beatles world, and everyone has a story.
It's impossible to overstate the importance of the Beatles. I am sometimes asked by young people, who have experienced the Beatles because their grandparents were Beatles fans, right? And they're so far removed from Beatlemania, and I mean mania. When they hit, literally by the time they got into the first chorus of All My Lovin', they were the biggest thing in the world.
Today's guest is E Street drummer Max Weinberg. In 1974, Max was playing in pit bands for theatrical productions when he answered the Village Voice advertisement that would change his life. The ad requested a drummer capable of playing R&B and jazz, specifying no Junior Ginger Bakers, for an audition. Weinberg had never seen Bruce Springsteen in the E Street Band and was unfamiliar with their material, but the skill, acumen, and attentiveness he displayed on Fats Domino's Let the Four Winds Blow won him the job. His ability to take cues from Springsteen, specifically playing a rim shot when Bruce held up his hand to stop the band and then starting back into the song, made a strong impression. Max joined the E Street Band at the same time as new pianist Roy the Professor Bittan. Dubbed the Mighty Max, his crisp, powerful drumming is a highlight of such hits as Born in the U.S.A., as well as deeper album cuts like Candy's Room. Following the band's hiatus in 1989, Max worked on several different projects. Beginning in 1993, he went on to great success as the musical director and band leader for Late Night with Conan O'Brien, assembling a top-flight set of musicians to form the Max Weinberg Seven. In 2014, Max was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a member of the E Street Band. In 2017, he launched Max Weinberg's Jukebox, an interactive live music show where the program changes nightly based on audience requests chosen from an ever-changing song list. Mighty Max will be performing at the inaugural Everything Fab Four Fest, taking place this November 6th through 8th at the Berkeley Oceanfront Hotel in Asbury Park, New Jersey, where we'll be celebrating the 60th anniversary of the Beatles' Rubber Soul album. Visit ef4fest.com for more information and to book your tickets today. Welcome, Max Weinberg. Why don't we start at the start? When did you first pick up a drumstick?
Oh, that's a great question. I actually, before picking up drumsticks, I was the recipient by my father as a result of watching a 15-minute TV show in 1954, 55, that starred Xavier Cugat and his wife, Abby Lane, who was a fiery redhead and singer, and his orchestra. And very similar to the part that Desi Arnaz played on TV, but, they were both band leaders. And everyone in that band played some sort of drum at one point or another. My parents saw my interest in being glued to the little black and white TV set they had. In those days, TVs were probably 13 inches square, if that. They came in a piece of furniture as big as a sofa. And my father went out to the local music store, which at the time in Newark was called Dorn and Kirshner on Springfield Avenue, and bought me a real miniature conga drum. Now, it wasn't a kid's toy. It was a real drum made just like a professional drum, but it was for a kid, and it had a white strap. And I still, wow, all these years later, 71 years later, I still have that drum.
Oh.
And it was my first experience with linking up my energy to any kind of organized rhythm. About a year later, became intensely aware of music because I had two very much older sisters who were young teens. And they knew that Elvis was making his debut not on the Ed Sullivan Show, but on the Dorsey Brothers Summer Replacement Show. He went from there to the Milton Berle Show. So I can remember, I think the Dorsey Brothers, it was about a year, I think, before Ed Sullivan. So it may have been in 1955, late 55. And Ed Sullivan was 56, I believe. And in those days when they filmed a TV show, they had one camera. So you saw the drummer as much as you did anyone else. So they looked like a band. I didn't know what a band was, but you had a drummer, a guitar player, a stand-up bass player, and this wild man singing. And my sisters were primed for that age to be big Elvis fans. And when he finally debuted on that's when I actually picked up the drumsticks after seeing DJ Fontana play with Elvis on the Dorsey Brothers show. When then he was on, you got to remember TV, 3 channels and an educational channel. So your options were very limited in those, extremely limited. Forget remotes. You, of course, had to get up from the sofa to or the floor to change the channel. And that actually, because as a child, you weren't allowed to touch the channel changer, the dial. So, and your parents didn't want to get up. So you would develop this loyalty to stations, in this case, CBS. And the other stations, there were basically 2 major stations, CBS and NBC. And ABC came along much later when it was originated. And in any case, after seeing DJ play with Elvis on the Ed Sullivan Show, when I was 5, that's when I first actually picked up the drumsticks, and I had an affinity, both affinity and I could follow a rhythm, and that's what I did. And I never looked back. And here we are all these years later. I'm still playing, still loving it. And when I do play, I'm like a 14-year-old kid. And, just jumping around a little bit, I was a novelty act as a kid, as a 7-year-old, 6.5, 7 years old. I could play like a rat-tat-a-tat march beat. I could play one song, When the Saints Come Marching In. And I was fearless behind the drums. I was a very shy kid. Early on, I had braces. I had glasses. I had 2 years without glasses and everything went south. I had an unusual name for the early 50s, Max, which my mother always said, well, of course, I was named after my grandfather, but she said, eventually you will grow into your name. Because everybody was named, Doug, Billy, Steve, Tommy. Yeah. And Max. I mean, who names a newborn Max? But I was named proudly after my grandfather Max. In any case, I was at how I got into the idea of professionalism in drumming was after I picked up the sticks. I hadn't taken lessons. I just could bang out a tune. and eventually did go to take formal lessons and learn how to read music and everything else. But we were at some sort of event at a catering hall, and my mother went up to the band leader. This was in Essex County, New Jersey, South Orange and Maplewood. We were at the time living in Maplewood, having just moved from Newark. And she asked the band leader if I could sit in. And he looked at her like she was crazy. And then he looked at me like, no, and my mother was a bit of a stage mother. So I did get to sit in with this guy. And I wailed on the drums. This was 1950, beginning of 58, I guess. And it was an entry into a world. And now I got a chance to perform on the drums, one song. But this guy, who was a well-known band leader, was one of the oldest people I'd met, other than my parents at the time. He was probably 30. Got such a kick out of it, he started hiring me at his club dates, weddings, bar mitzvahs, whatever he played. He played trumpet. And so he'd pay me a quarter. And a quarter in 1958, really, you could buy a comic and a milkshake for a quarter.
It had actual economic power.
Well, I had the beginnings of connecting playing music with earning a living. And I've always been directed in that way as a jobbing drummer. They used to call them legitimate drummers. So you had to play everything convincingly. Latin, cha-chas, merengues, tangos, learn the 3 or 4 different tangos and mambos, and all these sort of subsets of what you might encounter at a club date. Swing, a little Dixieland. Rock and roll was not played at all. It wasn't played on the radio. It had not made its way into the mainstream at all. When I started playing drums, it was all, Dixieland and swing. So I was a little kid, but I had an old man's perspective because I was doing this music that, it was classic American, standards and legitimate drumming. By the time I met Bruce and the E Street Band 17 years or so later, I'd been playing professionally at that point, for 16, 17 years, playing all kinds of music, including the circus, strip clubs, you name it, and playing in the midway of the carnivals that would come through town. And I remember I was in a performance of the Clyde Beatty and Cole Brothers Circus, which I think they made their way all through Jersey, but they were in North Jersey. And it was a great training ground. And so that's when I really, in the mid 50s was when I really dug into the drums. I didn't get a drum set of my own. When I sat in with this band leader, his name was Herbie Zane, pretty well-known guy in North Jersey. The crime fiction writer Harlan Coben includes him in every book. They're both from Livingston, New Jersey. And I would play on their drummer's drum set, his drummer's drum set. So I didn't get my own drum set until it was December of 62, because I had the drum set. And in June of 63, I can remember playing at a 5th grade graduation party to 6th grade at a classmate's name who was Laurie, about 4 blocks from my house, with my own band. Now I'm getting the dates straight. So by... I had been taken, we're jumping around a little bit, but it's a podcast, so it's a conversation. I had been taken when I was 10 years old, 1961, this summer, like the end of summer. My family's business was a summer camp up in the Pocono Mountains. And my oldest sister, who was quite a bit older, took me to what was then, it still may even be an annual occurrence, the Wayne County Fair, which was at it was sort of like a racetrack, like a dirt track, not fancy at all. And in the summer of 61, the Beach Boys, the original Beach Boys with David Marks, did a East Coast tour. And they made their way up the East Coast, and they ended up, one of their dates was in Pennsylvania. and I got to see the Beach Boys in 1961. I think they had their first record out, and nobody, I was in the Pocono Mountains. Surfing wasn't a thing in the Pocono Mountains, obviously. So
No.
that was the first experience I had seeing. They looked like the Kingston Trio, with striped shirts, but they had a beat and they had a drummer, of course, Dennis Wilson. And so I became a lifelong Beach Boys fan. I still am, and of their music, and got to play with them many, many times. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. So I was kind of tangentially aware of rock and roll. In October of '63, now I had the drum set and I was playing little jobs around town. One of the first things I did was we played my band, and someone recently sent a picture of my band, which had trumpet, stand-up bass, and piano. We were called the Epsilons. At the 7th grade dance in September of '63. Someone sent me a picture. Someone took a picture of us playing, and I have that picture. In October of '63, the Beach Boys played in West Orange, New Jersey, at the Armory on Pleasant Valley Way. And I was taken there by an older friend, and there were like 5 bands on it, vocal groups, doo-wop groups backed by a rhythm section. And I was pretty close to the stage, 5th to 6th row. And when the Beach Boys came on, all the girls, this is in '63, all the girls rushed the stage. And and jumped on Dennis Wilson, the drummer. And that's when I decided, hey, that's the job for me. I want to do that. And I don't know whether it was the drum, and he was a great drummer, great live drummer. But it was also the fact that, he was kind of the visual focus of that band. In any case, leading into the Beatles, so I was scheduled to play another school dance in November of that year, November of '63, and the date happened to be November 22nd, 1963. And I had my drums at school, my little 3-piece Blue Sparkle Kent make drums. And of course, at 1:30, the principal came on the speaker that was in every classroom and told us that President Kennedy had been assassinated. And it was the darkest day of my life to that point, and I've never quite gotten over it. It was my generation's 9/11, I would suppose. In fact, I'm sure. And I was a huge, I don't know if you can call a 12-year-old a fan, but a huge fan of JFK. Once wrote him a letter, got an answer.
Oh.
Not from him. I got an answer from actually a guy who was, he was a special advisor to the president. His name was Ralph Dungan, assuring me the president got and read his letter. And I know this because I was given a tour of the Kennedy Museum, John JFK Museum up in Boston. And I told the curator about this letter I wrote. And about 2 months later, I got a copy of the letter. And wow. By the way, everybody in my class wrote a letter. So, in my 6th grade class. So, it was not, I don't know if it was of my own volition, but we all wrote a letter. But we all got answers, apparently. In any case, I had a group of friends, in 7th grade. And one of the friends, a girl who we were all friends with, was going to England that week with her family as her father had a business trip going to London. And she left like 2 days before, the Thanksgiving vacation. Well, actually, she left a week before that. Now you're really stretching my memory. And because she wasn't there on November 22nd, she was in London. But when she came back after Thanksgiving, she brought Introducing the Beatles, which I guess was their second album. that was called Meet the Beatles in the United States. And so this would have been the first week of December 1963. And of course, the Jack Parr, who was the second Tonight Show host, I think a week later had a video that he played, but it was on 11:30, and of course I wasn't watching it. But I listened to this album. It was a totem, it was like she said, this is the biggest thing going on in England. And, you got to remember, there were no communications in those days, it was a different world. But she brought this record, and I can recall vividly, her name was Jane, a bunch of us going to her house, and she put this album, mono album, not even stereo, on the record player. And it was a revelation to me. Although I was pretty familiar with the Everly Brothers, who were a singing duo, who had plenty of hits, lots of hits in the 50s and early 60s. So, and of course the Beatles were mightily influenced by the Everly Brothers. So it kind of sounded like that, but not. Because mainly in the rhythm section, it was wild, it was loud, it sounded like nothing you ever heard, although it sounded in some ways like everything you ever heard, if that makes sense. But I was immediately, grabbed. This was in the beginning of December 1963, and I had no idea other than the picture on the cover. And I think there was a picture, there may have been a picture on the back, and I have to look again. But, the Beatles. In the beginning of January, maybe the first week, second week, you started seeing billboards on Route 3, not Route 3, where the New Jersey Turnpike goes through it turns off from the Meadowlands. There was a radio station there. And there was a billboard outside that said, "The Beatles are coming." And I made the connection, Beatles, hey, that record, what do you mean they're coming? That's all it said. And then they announced sometime in December that the Beatles would be on the Ed Sullivan Show, which, was by far the most popular Sunday TV show at 8:00. I mean, it was a ritual. It was the electronic fireplace, and it was the most watched variety show of the time. And there were a lot of variety shows. There was Milton Berle, and there was Sid Caesar, and there were sketch comedy, and a little bit like Saturday Night Live, but they also had they had guests on, guest performers. Ed Sullivan wrapped it all in a package that, if I would recommend to anybody, and you probably do as a professor of this history, to go back and look at, then there's a number of DVDs out of the best of Ed Sullivan, and look at the shows that occurred before February 9th, 1964, and you'll see the cross-section of entertainment. And so, I was getting excited, like, wow, I'm going to get a chance to see the Beatles. And I know, the friends who were interested in that kind of thing, everybody watched Ed Sullivan, but you could see the Beatles. And Ed Sullivan had, rock people on. I mean, he had Buddy Holly. Of course, he had Elvis. He had, Ricky Nelson, who was a big TV star, the TV show, and also had hit records, made great records. And so in those days, news on TV was 15 minutes a night at 6:00. That was it.
That's right.
And, again, we never had a color TV. My parents never had a color TV. I mean, that was an exotic, expensive item, and we never had a color TV. So I did see they had, newsreel footage of the pandemonium at the Plaza Hotel. And I certainly knew the Plaza Hotel because I have New York cousins. So, I'd go there. I'd been there, way before I didn't stay there, but, we'd go with my cousins they used to have this garden, the palm court. It was on the first floor. And it was, they're it's where you had breakfast. It was a restaurant. It was a big deal to go to the palm court. And, they're staying at the Plaza, and there's the pandemonium, and and they showed a little bit of them coming off the airplane at Idlewild Airport, which of course now is JFK, and it was just like the world went from when they made their debut. I mean, I think it's a metaphor that people have used, but it was sort of like your 11 and 12-year-old existence went strictly from black and white to color as soon as Paul McCartney counted off All My Lovin'. And it gave meaning to everything that I had been doing at that point for, 6 years, really digging into the drums. I loved playing football, touch football, and I was a really good place kicker. But my parents, both of whom were great athletes, my father played football for the University of Pennsylvania. They didn't want me to play any kind of contact sport. I was very upset at the time, but now I am so thankful.
Yeah, they were right, as we now know.
They were right. My mother was a gym teacher in Newark for 46 years, but no contact sports. Tennis. I didn't play any sports, and I wasn't particularly good at baseball. I had bad eyes. Any sports that you needed vision for, shooting a basket, forget it, but I was a good kicker. And so when the Beatles, I was probably as devoted to practicing kicking a football on a kicking tee, as I was music. But suddenly, when the Beatles debuted, everything just went towards the Beatles and the fantasy that you could be like the Beatles. I mean, I was playing drums and I had this band. Of course, we were sort of a Dixieland band. We had a trumpet, piano, acoustic bass, and drums. So the next day, Monday, I started looking for a guitar player. I'm telling you, on Monday the 10th, I started looking for a guitar player, and there was I was in 7th grade. There was a 9th grader who played guitar. And I remember his name was Larry, and I hooked up with him. And, eventually by, March, I actually had a band, like an electric band. No bass. Bass was exotic. Wow. I didn't play with a bass player until 1965. But, interestingly enough, I mean, it was guitar, and there was a saxophone player in it for a while, but he was in 9th grade. So he dropped out, and I kept playing with this, guitar, this other 9th grader who played guitar. And I'm sure we were terrible, but we were very enthusiastic. And
it makes up for a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly in rock and roll, because it's such a music of the people, essentially. It's you literally, as Bruce has said many times, you learn 2 chords and you're off. 3 chords and you can work. And, so it's impossible to overstate the importance of the Beatles. And likewise, all the other English groups that followed. But we're focusing on the Beatles. And I am sometimes asked by young people, who have experienced the Beatles because their grandparents were Beatles fans, right? And they're so far removed from Beatlemania, and I mean mania. When they hit, literally by the time they got into the first chorus of All My Lovin', they were the biggest thing in the world. So I liken it to the creation of the internet or the invention of the cell phone. How how wildly earth-shattering their debut was. And everything shifted. It shifted for young people, but it also shifted in the entertainment business because now everybody wanted rock groups. Before it was like, these cretins playing rock and roll. And there were plenty of rock groups, but there was no bands. They were the first band that debuted on television. And that was a big deal. It was democratic. You had 4 distinct and unique personalities who each of them, John, Paul, George, and Ringo, had distinct musical personalities. Of course, Ringo and me being a drummer, I saw him and they had some close-ups, obviously. And that guy, I could tell, was having the time of his life, and he's 9 years older than me. And that's when I decided, come hell or high water, that's what I'm going to do. So I became singularly focused. So I never wrote songs. Really.
Did you have a need after that Sullivan Show performance to get out and get some Ludwigs, or was it not like that?
No. The Ludwig drums. No, I had my first set. I had this Kent set. Ludwigs. Are you kidding? That was like you have the money for I don't know, a Mini Cooper. But you really want a Ferrari. Ludwig, Gretsch, Slingland, these were completely out of reach of, unless you were a rich kid, and I wasn't a rich kid. And I actually had a friend whose father had a very successful multi-location Cadillac dealership in North Jersey. And he was a drummer, and he had everything. You go into he had like a room dedicated to drums. He had timpanis, gongs, cymbals.
Whoa!
He had a big Slingerland drum set. Not like a lot of drums, but he had like 2 floor tom-toms, 2 tom-toms. No, I had my Ken set, but I realized early on it wasn't about the drums. It was about the drummer. So I played the hell out of that Kent drum set. And it was actually a pretty good drum set. We in the E Street Band laughed because Bruce's first real guitar was a Kent.
That's right.
And, it was a Japanese company and they made really good instruments. I sold that set, that Kent set, I wish I still had it, for a Rogers Gray Ripple Pearl 3-piece set. And then shortly after that was in 1965, I bought a tom-tom, a floor tom-tom to match it. And actually that set I still have. We call it, by the way, Americans call them drum sets. English people call them drum kits. Mm-hmm. And I've always made that distinction. But, you couldn't find a bigger Beatles fan than myself and many of my friends and those of us who started bands. And I was the guy in our county, basically, that was the young kid with the growing out Beatle haircut. Uh-oh. Which I got in 8th grade, I got kicked out of school for. And I mean, it was so tame. It was just combed down over my forehead, but it wasn't a crew cut, like a joining the military haircut. That's what was popular. I was the first person to get busted in school for having, quote unquote, long hair. And trust me, I have pictures. It was not long. It wasn't combed back. So I guess they thought I was a bad influence. And my mother was very insulted and went down and basically pleaded my First Amendment rights and got me immediately, it was they sent me home and she was furious. He can wear his hair any way he wants to. She didn't really like my hair, but, she defended my right to wear it. But it was all part of the excitement of Beatlemania,
The one thing that I find interesting, and I know my students have the most trouble with, actually, is being able to understand. And this is why the class is so great, because, it's 13 weeks and you go from beginning to end, soup to nuts. You start with Love Me Do, you end with Abbey Road. And what I think they and myself to a certain extent can't fathom is how basically every time you turned your head and they came out with a new record, it was a different sound.
Well, they evolved very quickly. Their initial, their initial exposure in America was it was my favorite era, by the way, was their Beatlemania years and the Chuck Berry influence, Little Richard influence. And that could be both nostalgic, and I liked Chuck Berry and Little Richard. I was aware of them. Mm-hmm. I sought that out. There was a record store in my town, South Orange, where you could go in and, they literally had listening booths where you didn't have to buy the record first. You could check the record out. A 45, a small, was 29 cents. And an album was $1.09, forget it, buying an album, it was $1.99. Listen, when I got my driver's license, gas was like 28 cents. So, there was a different world. It was a burgeoning world. It was very, contrary to what people believe, the 50s and 60s, well, the 50s were not at all placid in terms of the world at large. But for a 13-year-old kid, I was just singularly focused on what the Beatles, the Dave Clark Five, eventually the Stones, the Who, the Animals, the Yardbirds, who came much later, all the English bands were doing. And I liked the Four Seasons. I loved the Beach Boys. I loved surf music, which was instrumental music, the Ventures. I often said when I was a kid that if I could find some musicians who played like the Ventures and sang like the Beatles, then I'd really have something going. The other thing your students might not realize is that in those days, no teenage bands played Beatle material. It was way too hard. That's what was great about the Stones. The Stones was based in blues, so that was relatively easy. The Stones, the Kinks, the first few Kinks songs were basically Louie Louie. And, by the Kingsmen. So, 1962, I think it was, or early 63, I was aware of, I had a little transistor radio and you heard those songs. And, Louie Louie, the song got banned because they thought it was suggestive lyrics. And that made it even more popular. So, but the Beatles were different. They had something going that was way beyond anything else. They weren't the only band that wore uniforms. And they were uniforms, and they wore uniforms off stage. They wore suits off stage. Brian Epstein cleaned them up, which of course famously John Lennon rebelled against his entire career, but made them palatable. They were black leather guys up until they met Epstein. So, every 3 months they came out with a double hit 45. And albums, the first few albums were basically compilations, until they got to Beatles 65, which was, they did A Hard Day's Night, again, a bunch of singles. Beatles 65 was in many ways the beginning of the turning point where they were very influenced by Dylan. And I think he famously said, after Revolver came out to them, to John Lennon or Paul McCartney, well, I get it now. You don't want to be cute anymore. That is one of my favorite quotes by him. And that interaction is so important because, as far as they were concerned, they were artists by then. And to have Dylan be missing that so much was kind of perplexing. Well, I mean, it was quite the sarcastic put down to particularly John Lennon, and they were so influenced from then on to experimental. They put down their template of pop songs, and one thing, certainly a younger generation might not realize is that there was a dividing line, pretty much around Birmingham North and Birmingham, England South, between pop music and blues. And Northern England was pop music, very influenced by the girl groups. I mean, no Shirelles, no Beatles.
Everything Fab Four is presented by Salon.com, the premier news, politics, innovation, and arts website. For more information, visit everythingfab4.com where you can learn more about our podcast and my latest Beatles-related book, Living the Beatles Legend, The Untold Story of Mal Evans. The Everything Fab Four theme song, Seize the Day, is provided courtesy of Black Rabbit, the high-octane Beatles cover band, an innovative psychedelic rock project from Rockaway Beach, Queens in New York City. Like what you heard today on Everything Fab Four? Be sure to subscribe, give us a rating, and recommend the show to your friends. Plus, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at EF4 Podcast. Distributed by Salon.com, Everything Fab Four is a Wonderwall production. Remember, it's a Beatles world, and everyone has a story.